Okay, hello. Happy Halloween. I hope that this video finds you well and you're having a lovely festive day. Do you like my cardigan? It's very party in the back, this cardigan. One of my colleagues called it spiritually aggressive and I made it myself. So we are gathered here today on this most hallowed of eves to talk about a phenomenon that is crawling its way through our culture at the moment. Something that is in our media, something that is in our spiritual practices, something that is just in the way that we are living our lives at the moment. And that is witchcraft. By the way, the drinking game for this video is how often I do this, because I have a feeling it's going to be a few. So I really wanted to talk about witchcraft because I feel like it is just having a moment right now. Obviously, the day this comes out, Halloween is 3 weeks away from the second part of Wicked coming out, the biggest film franchise at the moment, and that's all about witchcraft. There's been a rise in kind of witchy aesthetics of late. I feel like we had emos, we had goths, and now the kind of spooky thing to be at the moment is a little bit witchy. I feel like that is the spooky aesthetic of the moment. And also, just anecdotally, I have noticed in my life an increase in people that are interested in witchy practices. So in kind of new agey things like crystals or tarot, but also just in the ideas of Wicca and witchcraft and paganism. And I will go into those in this video if they are new concepts to you. And so this video is partly just me sating my curiosity and doing a little bit of research and seeing if those things that I have been noticing in my own life hold true more widely. Are there more people now interested in and practicing witchcraft? And also, I wanted to put to you my theory that witchcraft is kind of a perfect religious spiritual idea to emerge at this specific moment in history. I think a lot about how the ideas that we are interested in and the things that we bring into our lives, they're very rarely just completely unique. They often are because of the zeitgeist we're swimming in. They are feeding off different things. And I think there's just a few elements in the waters that we're swimming here at the moment that are really compatible with exploring witchcraft. And it's almost like a perfect storm that has led to lots of people being interested in witchcraft. So I wanted to kind of pull on those threads and see what cultural elements of the zeitgeist are leading us all down this witchy path into the woods. There's another one. And I also have for you today a few little hot takes, good and bad, about this phenomenon. Mostly good. I am a little bit of a witchy girl myself and I love my witchy girls, so no part of me is interested in this being a witchcraft hatey kind of video, but I do have a few things that I want to talk about. So hi, if you are new to the channel, my name is Lucy and I make content on environmentalism, connecting with nature, and also rebuilding your spirituality as an ex-religious atheist. I think the witchy content that I make kind of fits into all three of these categories, as I'm hoping you will see by the end of this video. But if any of that sounds like your vibe, please like and subscribe or send this to a friend as a little Halloween trick or treat. So let's start by talking about what is witchcraft, and specifically what is modern witchcraft. We all have an idea of what a witch is, you know, pointy hat, broomstick, cat, magic, cauldron, all of these kind of archetypes of the witch. And there are also kind of archetypes around the type of woman that a witch is. She's an older woman, she's a hag, she's something that doesn't fit typical beauty standards, like she's green or warty, she just doesn't fit the mold of what a good woman, what an attractive woman is. There is also a different type of witch that is often an archetype who is kind of more of a glamazon witch. Actually, often the storyline that we give to the kind of hag witch is that she is jealous of the glamorous woman in her life and she wants to move back towards the period of her life when she was young and beautiful and she wants to be glamorous. There's a couple of archetypes that women are often slotted into. One is the Madonna and whore complex, and the kind of glamorous witch is definitely the whore element. And then we have this idea, which is through a lot of pagan ideas, of the mother, maiden, crone. And the other kind of witch is definitely this crone. But she is never a maiden and she is never a mother. The kind of archetypes that we assign to being good women, the mother, the maiden, the Madonna, which is like a conglomerate of the two. The witch is never those. She is always the other kind of woman, the bad kind of woman.
Editing Lucy popping in here to say, obviously there are mother characters who are witches, like the Witch in Into the Woods or Mother Gothel, but they are not the kind of Miss Honey, she'll look after you, good woman. Also, interestingly, we did used to have a kind of wicked mother archetype, but over time we have reskinned her as a wicked stepmother. A lot of the stepmother characters, like in Snow White and Cinderella, they were originally, in the original stories, the mothers of those women. But I guess we have kind of defanged the concept of motherhood over time. And I also think the idea of competition between mothers and daughters has become more taboo. The idea that a mother would be competing with her daughter's attractiveness and seeing her as kind of sexual competition, that is a bit icky to modern tastes. And I think that's why that's kind of phased out. But that's what I mean when I say that witches are never mothers. They are never good Miss Honey mothers.
You know, we also have witches in culture that are kind of silly or mischievous, and they're definitely the type of witches that I really like. I really like a super powerful witch or a slightly silly, naughty witch. Those are definitely my favourite types of fictional witch. But that kind of witch is not really what I'm talking about when it comes to modern witchcraft. The movement and the ideas around modern witchcraft have a number of different adherents and origins, but a kind of core basis of ideas. And I just want to go through 3 types of people that I think fall under this category of people that are interested in modern witchcraft, people that are exploring modern witchcraft. The first is adherents of Wicca. Wicca is the witchcraft religion. It's the main witchcraft religion, and it's a super modern religion. It dates back to the 1940s. The origin stories of Wicca are really interesting because they are kind of based on a myth that was proven to be false later by academics. There was this interest in the early 20th century in this idea of a witch cult that used to be a part of the religious landscape of pre-Christian Europe. The idea was that these groups of witches worshipped a horned god, and then the reason for the witch trials was to suppress this cult religion. It was kind of people being tried for heresy and people being tried for their heathen beliefs. And that lots of the people that were tried in the witch trials were members of this witch cult, and that the witch trials were an act of religious suppression. This was an idea that was particularly popularised by a lady called Margaret Murray, who I have a real soft spot for, even though all of her theories were basically wrong. She wrote this book about the witch cult, and it was a really influential book. There were also a number of other books written at this time that were looking into these ideas of witchcraft and the Wheel of the Year. And in the 1940s, this man, Gerald Gardner, kind of put them all together, and in the 1950s this idea of Wicca was born and then was popularised. And we kind of, over the last half a century, have seen a big rise in the number of people who are interested in Gardnerian Wicca, as it is known after Gerald Gardner, and the kind of ideas around witchcraft. Wicca is a really interesting religion because it is really kind of lawless. It's not like religions that have a strict doctrine, a strict code, a strict creed. It has one core tenet, which is called the Wiccan Rede, and it goes, "Do as you will, but harm none." And that is it. All you have to do is do whatever you want, just don't hurt anyone. It's this kind of very liberated type of religion where you really can, you know, do your own thing and steer your own path. I think the idea of harming none is really lovely because it's used really expansively by a lot of witches. Witches might think of animals as included in the idea of harming none, or they might think of the whole earth and the whole ecosystem and how can we work in accordance with it without harming it. Those are all ideas that kind of come through in this read. And the way that Wicca is practiced is also, a broad church, people will do things like follow the wheel of the year. They will have their own magical practices. I'm not going to go into magic too much in this video. Suffice to say, magic in modern witchcraft is not kind of levitating or kind of doing crazy supernatural things. It's often a way of reframing the cause and effects that we see in the world as magic. It's things like using certain herbs with healing properties will lead to a positive outcome, that kind of thing. There are definitely some sort of kooky beliefs in magic in the witchy fold, but you know, generally we're talking about quite simple cause and effect types of magic. So there are lots of different ways to practice modern witchcraft, and it also has become easier to start as a Wiccan or become a Wiccan over time. Male and female Wiccans are both called witches. It's a gender neutral term in Wicca. And when the religion started, a lot of practitioners were part of covens or groups. But over time, it has become a lot more common for people to just practice on their own and consider themselves a solitary witch. So the first strand is Wicca and people who practice Wicca. And there has been a rise over time in people who consider themselves Wiccans. So the second strand, when we think about what is modern witchcraft, is the people who practice ideas that are similar to Wicca, but do not consider themselves as Wiccans or witches. I think there is a whole big group of people who are interested in ideas around paganism and the kind of core tenets of witchcraft and these ancient earth-based religions without necessarily considering themselves witches, Wiccans. I tend to think of paganism as a bit of an umbrella term for all of these different groups. And there has been a big rise in people that are interested in paganism and pagan festivals and pagan practices. In the UK, we have a census every 10 years, and from 2011 to 2021, which was when our last census was taken, there was a rise of 13,000 more people identifying as pagan between those two censuses. The other stat, which really, I think, speaks to how popular paganism and witchcraft are at this specific moment, is the figures of people visiting Stonehenge on the summer solstice. So going to a stone circle to celebrate the summer solstice, the winter solstice, that is a classic pagan festival. And in 2024, 15,000 people went to Stonehenge, the most famous stone circle in the UK. In 2025, it was 25,000. So that's a rise of 10,000 more people going to this pagan ritual for the summer solstice. And that census was taken obviously a few years ago in 2021. And I would bet money that the number of people identifying as pagans now has gone up since that census was taken, just based on that Stonehenge data alone. I know it might feel weird to talk about paganism in this video about witchcraft, but I really think that a lot of the ideas have this same kind of origin, looking back to a specific point in history, looking to the earth. I think these are all very tied together. And I also think because adherents of Wicca and paganism are so individual, it's really hard to draw distinct lines between these groups because everyone's kind of doing a little bit their own thing and it all overlaps in different ways and the way people use labels is slightly different. So I just think it's easier to consider them as a similar grouping altogether. The third thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about modern witchcraft is the ideas that are in the zeitgeist right now that are just a little bit new age or occult. So we have things like crystals and tarot cards. They're all really popular right now. And I think what's interesting about these is they are not just being practiced by people who consider themselves witches or whatever. They are being practiced by loads of different people. Loads of different people are just picking up one or two of these practices and incorporating it into how they process and think about their lives or how they manage their lives. There's always going to be kind of occult or woo ideas floating around. And I think the aesthetic that these ideas are currently taking on is witchcraft. Witchcraft is just a cool thing to participate in right now. So that's kind of my third element of like witchcraft for the casual user. So those are my kind of elements we're talking about when we're talking about modern witchcraft. I now want to dig into the zeitgeist of ideas that is bringing witchcraft to the fore and that is making this cultural moment, the perfect time for witchcraft to have a revival. These ideas that I'm going to talk about, they're not necessarily in any particular order. You know, we're all swimming in a cultural soup and elements kind of overlap and cross over each other all the time. So I'm not going to pull out single strands and say this is the main one or this is the first one. It's all kind of a mixture that has led us to this point. And I think that's what's so interesting about it, the kind of tapestry that has woven witches into our lives. But it would be crazy to not start with this first idea, and that is women's liberation. The feminist movement, the women's lib movement, the active liberation of women through the invention of the pill and the ability for us to have some control over our journey into motherhood and our sexual lives. And the fact that this fed on from, you know, women's voting rights, women's financial rights, women's rights to be free from violence in their marriages. All of these rights are something that over the last century women have really actively fought for and worked to maintain, sometimes with more success than other times. What's really interesting is that when we look at the times when witchcraft has been really popular, it often does kind of come with these feminist waves. So there was a big interest in feminism in the 70s, which is obviously, you know, after the invention of the pill. In the 90s, we had kind of girl power, but we also had an interest in witchcraft. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, cultural icons of witchcraft were being created in the 90s as well. And then we have our current era, and we are currently post-Me Too, and that has also led to a spike in interest in witchcraft. For me, I think that the images of witchcraft are so powerful for women. Firstly, when we look at what the kind of objects of magic are in witchcraft, a lot of them are just domestic items. They are just items that women have used for centuries to keep the household and keep our lives running. They are items of what has been denigrated as women's work. So cauldrons are just cooking pots. We have spindles that look like wands for spinning wool. All of these witchy utensils, they just have their origins in women's work. And the idea of these objects that have been denigrated being treated as scary and powerful objects that demand respect is a really powerful image for a lot of women. I was visiting some family in Cambridge the other week, and we went to the Cambridge Museum, which used to be the Cambridge Folk Museum. And because it's near Halloween, they had a little witchcraft trail. They had this activity where you could make your own witch bottle. So that is what this is, sitting on my shelf here. But they also had all of these artifacts from domestic life for the last few centuries. They had cauldrons as cooking pots, and they had all of these different objects. But the most amazing thing I saw was this work in progress piece of a lace cushion being created, the lace being created. And it was extraordinary because it looks so fiddly. There are about 20 different wooden bobbins that the weaver was obviously interchanging and working together and not getting muddled and not getting all tangled. And when you see these things, you cannot help but recognize the artisanship and the skill that goes into something like lace making. It's extraordinary. It takes such a level of skill and knowledge. And that's the same with all of these so-called, you know, everyday run-of-the-mill domestic skills. They all require a lot of skill. I have a friend who is an excellent textile artist. She actually was recently attempting to teach me to spin with a drop needle, and I'm just rubbish at it. I need to do more practicing because I just was not picking it up. I was trying, but it was not kind of going in for me. You have the spindle and you're dropping it like this, but you also have a staff, and it's called a distaff, and it literally looks like the staff you've seen every fairy godmother ever carry, with the cage on the end that you put your unspun yarn in, and then you pull it down as you spin. And when I see my friend use these, you know, witchy tools, it is kind of like watching a magic act at work. She's really good at making lace, and when she's making lace, she's just doing this, and the lace is appearing as if from thin air. And you can kind of see the way that this might be really intimidating to people who don't understand what's happening, or people who are really kind of threatened by the skill that these women had, and who might go, what are you doing? I don't understand what it is you're doing. That looks crazy. That is witchcraft. So exploring witchcraft is a way of reclaiming that power in what has been historically denigrated because of misogyny and because of what has been seen as women's work.
Just jumping in to say the lens from this point is going to start steaming up. Maybe it's magic. I think my house was just getting too cold and the lens couldn't cope with the change in temperature. So it's not your eyes, it is the video. But, you know, hopefully you think it's a magical Halloween effect. I will say as well, as a left-wing channel, I definitely have my biases in this area. And I think this idea of reclaiming domestic labour is in a really, you know, weird and potentially dangerous place at the moment. I'm going to talk in the next section about the rising Christian nationalism, but we do have the whole tradwife movement at the moment, which is all about women, you know, going back to their homes and doing domestic labour and not being in a formal workplace. But I think when we go back to the Wiccan creed of do what you will and harm none, it's that do what you will, it's that freedom, and it should be that freedom to choose. So yes, we can respect the fact that throughout history, women haven't had as many choices about what they can do, and we can respect that they were really skilled in the roles that they were able to have without saying, so that's all they should be able to do.
I also think that a lot of the feminist power that comes through exploring witchcraft comes in this idea that the witches of the past were not kind of evil hags. There is this idea in modern witchcraft that the witches of the past were just the village wise woman, the person that you would go to if you had an ailment, whether that be physical or even emotional. You know, like in The Little Mermaid, if you're forlorn in love, you go to the witch and she will help you. And the idea that these were women who had skills in things like herbalism might not match up to modern medicine, but at the time it was all we had. All we had was, you know, working out what herbs probably did what. The idea that those women were the ones that were being denigrated, and the idea that that would be threatening to people. If a woman knows what things in the woods are capable of healing you, she probably also knows what things in the woods are capable of poisoning you. And I think men who don't trust women, that's where the fear comes in. Having an educated woman who knows the natural world and who knows all these things about it, that is a threatening idea. But there is a power in that, of thinking well of these women of the past, of rewriting history in a way that respects the skills that they brought to the table and the power that they probably had on some level in their communities as a result of that. I think another strand of feminism in the modern witchcraft revival is anger. When you've considered all of these ideas, it makes you really angry to think about the way that patriarchy has shaped the narrative in the opposite way, the way that patriarchy has cast these women as crones, as evil, as hags, as ugly, as unskilled. They're just kind of out to, you know, ruin the community, as dangerous, when we know in the witch trials who were the dangerous ones, and it wasn't the women being burned at the stake. So I think there is a lot of feminist anger as well in the modern witchcraft revival. We, from our modern point of view, can recognise the historical injustices of things like the witch trials. We don't, as a society, generally believe that witchcraft in this traditional sense exists. So how dare the men of the past kill all of these women for what? For nothing, apparently. There have been some really positive strides in correcting this history recently. In 2022, a pressure group from Scotland managed to get an official apology from the Scottish government for the witches that were killed in the witch trials in Scotland. And they also have created a witches' tartan to commemorate these women. And now there are a number of other councils in other areas that are pushing for these pardons to be given. Part of the modern witchcraft movement is part of this wider feminist idea of redressing the role of women in society and the historical ideas that we've been given about women that have been passed down to us that are based on misogyny. This is about redressing that balance. And so witchcraft and feminism, they are so inextricable. Obviously, Wicca is something that can be practiced by someone of any gender, but there is this idea that historically, most of the people that were killed in the witch trials were women. So feminism and witchcraft, bedfellows, they just go together.
There is also another area of kind of feminist thought in witchcraft, which I have more difficulty with. I think that one thing that appeals to a lot of women about witchcraft is the idea of the cycles in nature being related to things like the menstrual cycle. And I think it would be remiss to say that there's no trans-exclusionary wing of the witchcraft movement. It's also individual. I think when we do look at the founders of modern witchcraft, there is a lot to question there. Some of them were involved in far-right politics. A lot of the men had age gap relationships with women that were much, much younger than them. And, you know, all adults, but there's just some icky stuff in the actual foundation. These core ideas are based on European religions, and there is definitely some white nationalist ideas that come through in the witchcraft movement. But then also witchcraft is something that is really embraced in queer culture and is embraced by people who don't fit the norms of patriarchal society. So it's messy, is what I'm trying to say. I think this is something that has wide appeal because we're in this very individualist movement and people can marry up witchcraft to their politics in different ways. One area of witchcraft that I don't know much about, but is definitely really interesting and positive, is people that are reclaiming their African witchcraft heritage. Obviously, there are lots of countries where the history of colonialism is so recent and the kind of Christian norms that were brought in with that colonialism. So ideas of witchcraft are still, you know, around and real to lots of people. And there are ideas under this umbrella of witchcraft that are about embracing those folk religions that were there before colonialism and about reclaiming witchcraft in parts of the world where it's still a dangerous thing to be. It's complicated and political and messy is what I'm trying to say. And because when societies get more educated, they tend to become more individualist. There are so many different strands to what is quite an individualist religion.
The next thread that I kind of want to pull on is the idea that current witchcraft trends are partly a response to the rise in Christian nationalism. Obviously, in America right now, we are seeing a huge rise in Christian nationalism, and also we're seeing a rollback of women's rights. We've seen the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is terrible and, you know, just puts women in danger. But so many of these ideas are justified by Christian nationalism. In the UK, we don't necessarily have these ideas with the church being able to control the state, which is kind of weird because obviously we do have a state church. We have the Church of England. There's definitely not this culture of Christianity pushing the agenda like there is in America. When that does happen in the UK, it tends to feel like it's something that we've borrowed from the States. But interestingly, in the UK, there has been a huge decline in people identifying as Christians. The census data from 2021 that I mentioned before, that was the first census where less than 50% of the British public self-identified as Christians. And most of the reason for this can be explained not by a rise in other religions, though there were small increases in some other religious groups. It is mostly explained by people now identifying as not having a faith. There has been a huge drop in the number of people who identify as Christian and a huge rise in people who identify as atheist or not associated with a religious group. So that means there are loads of more fun people like me floating around, religionless, that kind of might be interested in some of the ideas that a more free-form religion like Wicca, or these ideas that you can kind of just pick up like tarot, we're kind of interested in those. They're available to us. And I also think that particularly for groups of people that have come from traditional religions, from patriarchal religion, as a lot of Christianity is pretty patriarchal. Even if you're part of a really liberal type of Christianity, it's going to have to get so liberal before there are any ideas of, you know, God not being male and God not being a father figure. So all of these ideas are very much like there are men and then the women kind of trot along after, often not being allowed to, you know, be priests, be vicars, even speak in church, be anything except mothers. It's, you know, there are the options for women in lots of religious spaces are really limited. Again with the feminism, there is a reason why women who come from a patriarchal religion would be interested in something like witchcraft, which puts people of all genders on an equal footing, if not putting women's experiences a little bit higher. I think for people of all genders, there is something really attractive about going for witchcraft after you've come from a traditional religion. I think there's something really appealing about going for anything that is kind of spooky or even, you know, demonic or forbidden when you come from a religious institution, because a lot of religious authoritarianism, religious control, is based on fear, and they couch a lot of that fear-mongering that they do in supernatural language. They talk about hell, they talk about demons, they talk about evil, and anything kind of spooky or witchy is an example of that evil, that hell. I think there is so much power in saying, hey, you told me I needed to be afraid of all of these spooky things. Well, I'm not going to let you control me anymore. I'm not going to be afraid of any of the things that you told me to be afraid of. I am going to make my own mind up, and I'm so unafraid of this that I'm going to pursue it, and I'm going to explore it for myself, and I'm going to pick the spookiest, scariest, most fear-inducing thing that I can think of and look into that. I think the kind of prime example of people doing this is the Satanist movement. Whenever you talk about real-life Satanists, it's very rarely people who are just like, yeah, we love Satan, go on devil. It's usually people who are trying to engage in some sort of dialogue about religious freedom and pose some sort of critique of Christian authoritarianism and Christian nationalism. The Satanic Church in America does things like question whether the Ten Commandments should be put everywhere all the time, and they put in requests for statues of the goat god Baphomet to be placed next to these Ten Commandments, because there should be a separation of church and state in the US according to the Constitution. So if there is religious freedom and the Ten Commandments are allowed, Baphomet should also be allowed, but it doesn't always work out like that. So they're kind of trying to test the boundaries of religious freedom and test the boundaries of hypocrisy around church and state. I also think that the Addams family are a good example of this kind of contrarian approach to engaging with witchcraft or Satanism or spookiness. You've kind of got this gothic, spooky family that are obsessed with death, and they've got a hand walking around, they've got an undead butler. This is not the blonde Christian archetype of a perfect all-American family, but this family of spooky, witchy people, they actually are family goals. Gomez and Morticia have an absolutely couple goals, strong marriage, the family all work things out together. And that is a searing critique on how we judge people under a kind of Christian patriarchal system. They're also a Latino family, and at this time when ICE are performing raids on so many good people in America that don't deserve for their families to be separated, the Addams family really does hold up a light to the supposed Christian ideals of the American state. And you know, we have a president who is openly talking about Christian values, who is openly using prayer and using the symbolism of Christianity to further his fascist agenda. It's a time when Christian nationalism is really on the rise, and this kind of witchy, spooky backlash is only going to rise with it. I also just want to mash these two ideas together of the religious nationalism and the feminism and talk about the concept of being a good girl. I talked about at the start these archetypes of what a woman is and what a witch is, and how all of the good women archetypes are not what a witch is. I think a lot of religious patriarchy relies on the idea of keeping women in their place, of making them obedient to men and making them kind of helpmeets for men, rather than, you know, individuals in their own right who are directing their own lives. I think there is a strand of people who are interested in witchcraft, and this isn't just women, this is also, you know, gender non-conforming people who are subject to things like sexual violence as well. There is a group of people who have tried the things like fitting in, and they've been told that, oh, if you're a certain way, you won't be subject to the violence of the system. We want you to be a certain way, and if you do this, you will be good and you will be safe and you will be happy. And they've tried that, and it's not worked. They've not been safe from the men in their lives. They've not been safe from the systems of oppression that we all live under. They have not been protected. But the idea of witches they are these magical beings who are powerful and who don't conform to what society has told them, and they keep themselves safe because they're magical and they're powerful and they live on their own and they control their own lives. And I think when the ideas of patriarchy start to crumble for women and gender non-conforming people, we are looking for ideas outside that norm that make us feel like we've got this and we're safe and we're powerful, or that are just more honest about how the world is sometimes rubbish and that there aren't ways of controlling every situation and there aren't ways of always keeping yourself safe. I think part of the appeal of witchcraft and spooky things in general is this embracing of the darker, more horrific sides of life. You know, it's not fun to always just be super positive and forcing on a smile when that's not what you feel and that's not what the situation demands. Some situations demand that we feel things in really deep ways and we grapple with our emotions and we process things and we help other people to process things through being available with our emotions. And I think part of the appeal of witchcraft is that it does explore areas like death and the unknown without providing all of the answers and without providing the certainty and without going, well, if you just follow these rules, you will be okay and you'll have eternal life. There is a basis in reality and basis in darkness and accepting the reality of the dark parts of the world in spooky, witchy ideas. And I think that is appealing to people who need to explore that.
And of course, one of the central ideas that religious patriarchy usually has for women is around sexual purity. And, you know, we are post-sexual revolution now. These ideas are not as popular as they once were. And in witchcraft, there are lots of strands to explore around sexual liberation and accepting your body in all of its ways. There are lots of witches that explore their connection to female deities that are associated with sex. Aphrodite is a popular altar figure for witches. Because witchcraft doesn't have a concept of sin outside of harming others, there is a lot of freedom from shame that comes with exploring witchcraft.
There is this quote that I absolutely love. David Bowie also really loved this quote, apparently. And I will put the name of the person who it is attributed to here. And the quote goes, "Religion is for people who fear hell. Spirituality is for people who have already been." And that just speaks to me so deeply. I think that all of these kind of individualized ways of exploring your spirituality, they are such powerful coping mechanisms for people who have been through really traumatic things and traumatic situations. It is a way of taking your power back, especially if you have been traumatized in a religious setting. Setting out on your own path is you saying, hey, I'm the captain now.
I'm the captain now.
I think the other thing that's worth noting when we're thinking about that quote and we're thinking about this particular moment in history is that interest in the occult and, you know, new age ideas and just like spiritual ideas in general, they often follow grief. And we have just been through a period of grief. We've just been through a pandemic when so many people lost people they love. When we look at the roots of occultism, when we look at the roots of spiritualism, which is the idea of talking to the dead, that originates in the Victorian culture when the infant mortality rate was really, really high. And there were so many, you know, grieving parents at that time. This is a tangent, but the roots of spiritualism are really interesting because they really spring out of the Industrial Revolution and this kind of spirit of invention that was in the air in the Industrial Revolution. And you've kind of got all of these post-Enlightenment ideas of people trying to answer these big esoteric questions, but with scientific rationale and scientific methods and, you know, instruments and inventions. So spiritualism is super interesting to me for the point in history where it sprung up, and maybe a period in time where people were starting to slightly lose that grip on the religious certainty of earlier ages. In the Victorian age, we also are obviously living in a post-Paradise Lost world. So the roots of Satanism are with us in the Victorian era as well. The main point is that occultism follows grief, and this is a period of grief. So it's no wonder in a way that witchcraft is in the air. My final kind of positive strand of why witchcraft is in the air before I move on to a few critiques is that we are in a moment of great ecological concern, and there is a lot of concern for the planet and care for the planet floating around at the moment. We know we're in a climate crisis. We know that we need to prevent too many degrees of warming happening. We know that we need to learn to look after the earth in a better way than we have been doing. And witchcraft, paganism, these are religious movements that have their basis in the earth. I think there are lots of really interesting ideas that we can pull from a few different places about how nature is personified through these religious expressions. There are a variety of different concepts of gods that crop up in modern witchcraft, from kind of ancient myths to kind of archetypes like the green man to pantheistic concepts of God, you know, where you believe everything in the world has a spirit or everything in the world is a god and everything around you is sacred. I think there is a lot of interesting philosophy happening with modern witchcraft, and obviously again it's practiced and thought about so differently by all the different practitioners. But there is this core concern for nature, this core connection to nature. I've talked on this channel before about my personal exploration of the Wheel of the Year, which is a way of looking at the seasons of the year. And that is an idea that is pulled from Gardnerian Wicca, that is pulled from witchcraft. And for me, it's a concept that reminds me of my relationship with the earth, and that reminds me of my responsibility to the earth and the desire I have to look after it. Again, I think with witchcraft, there is this very much thing of, I am an individual and I'm going to try my best to do what I can as an individual. But there are powerful people in the world who hold positions of authority that are doing things wrong, and I'm going to try and upset them and annoy them and do things that disrupt the order that they want, because I'm the wise woman. There's this quote from the witch in the musical Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim, where she goes, "I'm not good, I'm not nice, I'm just right. I'm the witch." And it's this idea that sometimes you are going to be the bad guy. Sometimes you're going to be the messenger that no one wants. Look at someone like Greta Thunberg, who is basically only speaking truth, who is only doing the right thing, who is only standing up for oppressed people and the planet. And she has been absolutely vilified. She is called all sorts of names, she's made fun of, but she's right. And she's not going to be nice about it. And she says over and over again, I'm not a hero. When she's been kidnapped by Israel so many times, she goes, you know, this is not a heroic action I've done. I'm just trying to do the bare minimum that the people who actually have some power should be doing. And I'm trying to get aid to these people who need it. In this way, she's kind of exemplifying this archetype of the witch, this person who is right, who is bang on the money, and who has just had to kind of grow a thick skin and just stand in her power and stand in her truth. And when we're talking about kind of all the different social justice issues that intersect with witchcraft and the environmental issues, it is this call to people to say, hey, you can stand in your power as an individual, and you don't always have to be so nicey-nicey when there are situations that need solving, and that when there are parts of the world that need fixing and the powerful people are not fixing them. You have power and you can tell them what you think. And how many times have we seen women, but you know, all sorts of people called horrible names and called ugly and called, you know, whatever it is. And this is where I kind of really like the idea of the like warty element of the witch. The idea of a wart as kind of a place where we've grown really thick skin. It feels like a physical manifestation of this thing that I want to develop so that I can kind of speak truth to power. Also, obviously, so much of this kind of imagery of what is ugly about the witch, it's just a postmenopausal woman. Like, for God's sake, people are so afraid of postmenopausal women that they have to paint them into this stereotype and paint them into this like image. When actually, when I think about my future and when I think about the women that I know, I think about how, oh my God, I can just say, I don't care about all of this anymore. I don't care about that. I just know what I think and I'm just going to say it because I've lived too long to care about your nonsense, and I'm not going to put up with it, and I'm wise and I've grown into my wisdom. And if you're going to denigrate my appearance and not listen to my ideas, then bye, you're wrong. I'm right, I'm the witch. So that's all my positive things to say about modern witchcraft. I do think there are a couple of strands in society that are less positive that are also feeding into modern ideas about witchcraft. One of them is this kind of alternative medicine, healerism side. We've obviously got the Maha movement in America, which is this big movement of people trying to remove all sorts of processed foods from the food system, which I have really mixed feelings about, and I don't want to go into it all here. I think there are goods and bads. Ultimately, a lot of the approach is quite fashy. A lot of the approach of the Maha movement is about controlling what poor people have access to and limiting what's available on food stamps and limiting people's access to the medical health system. That all seems really bad to me. I don't know, I feel like people should be allowed to have food and medical care. But in the UK, we've seen a massive rise in people not vaccinating their children and kind of not believing science. and wanting a kind of return to a more natural way of living. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with wanting to explore a more natural way of living. I just think that when it comes with a wholesale rejection of modern science, that's where it actually gets dangerous for people, because those vaccines save lives. I think so often the concerns that people have around things like vaccines stem from this idea that someone's profiting from us buying medicines and us having medicines. But whenever you kind of roll those arguments back to the people that originated them, they're all selling supplements and things that, you know, I feel like people are trying to make money. It's again back to this idea of fear mongering and people trying to make money from you in whatever way they can. And, you know, it's all fun and games doing like a herbal bath or whatever, but it's when it really harms people that it becomes a problem. And there are people who have been harmed by the medical system, especially people of colour, and also, again, women, gender non-conforming people. They don't always test the drugs on us. There is not a history of ethical treatment of people of colour in the medical system. Look at Henrietta Lacks as example one of many of people being mistreated by the medical system. So I can see why people are distrustful, and I can see why natural medicine is appealing. But at the end of the day, modern medicine is natural medicine that we've tested. Partly we're seeing this kind of wholesale rejection of stuff that saves lives, and that is the opposite of what those wise women would have wanted for the people in their village.
Also, one of the reasons I think we're seeing a rise in the idea of natural living, natural food, that kind of thing at this period in time might be partly because we are so digital. We're living in a society where we are spending so much time online and so much time on screens and in these kind of worlds which are not corporeal that we are craving physical reality, and we're craving a kind of natural experience. And I think that's coming out in lots of different ways. But there's something really analog about natural food. And I think that's where the instinct to pursue that in both right-wing and left-wing spaces is coming from. We all want a little bit of offline, detoxed, non-digital time in a very digital age.
The second critique that I have links more widely to the idea of capitalism in general. And it's also not something that I've seen constrained to witchcraft. I think it's something that runs the gamut through a lot of different spiritual ideas and spiritual belief systems at the moment. It's the same thing and it takes different forms. At this moment in history, we are in one of the most wealth unequal societies that we've seen for a century. The super rich have so much money, the rest of us have less and less and less. And there are a lot of people who really want to get themselves out of that situation, who want to be financially free and who want to be financially stable. And so the spiritual gurus have stepped in with a number of promises to people that they can solve their financial problems for them. In Christianity, we have the idea of the prosperity gospel. This is the idea that if you do certain things or if you pay a certain amount to the church in tithing, you will be rewarded financially, monetarily by God. And this also means that anyone in society who is rich, that's because they've just been blessed by God. You know, God really loves them more than the rest of us. God really, really loves the billionaires way more than the rest of us. And it is his will that they have loads of money and everyone else starve. In non-religious settings, this pops up as the law of attraction and also as manifestation. Now, I think a lot of people who are practicing manifesting are basically just goal setting. They're basically, you know, you do your vision board and then you pick out what you want to work towards and then you make active steps towards working towards that. And that's just, you know, working towards a goal. But when I think about the spiritual core of something like the law of attraction or manifestation, these are both ideas that go, if you think hard enough about this idea, if you put enough positive vibes out into the universe and attract this idea to you, it will happen through that process of vibe exchange. And these ideas just, they really make my skin crawl, because I just think, okay, it's all well and good if you feel like you put out something good into the universe and you got something good back. But what about when something bad happens? And then is it because, I'm sorry, you didn't pray hard enough, you didn't give the church enough money? Is it because, I'm sorry, you've just been putting negative vibes out into the universe, you've just been attracting bad things into your life and it's all your fault, and now you have to live with this horrible consequence that's happened in your life?
I think that the people who are powerful in this world really benefit from us thinking of ourselves as individuals and thinking that any failure that we have in our life is a result of our individual failings. And you know, this simply isn't true. When we have a system of extreme wealth inequality, where the richest are going to bed and waking up richer, and the rest of us, that is not happening for. The relative amount of wealth that we have is falling, and we are already struggling for things like housing and food even. The fact that food in the country where I live, which is one of the richest countries in the world, people are struggling to feed their kids. It's just outrageous. But it's a societal issue. It's a problem with the distribution of wealth in this country. And worldwide, this is a similar story. It's a problem with the distribution of wealth. And no amount of magical thinking is ever going to make it your fault that you're in that situation. But these ideas of kind of law of attraction, you know, we always hear about these ideas from people who are famous and who are successful and who are rich. So of course they believe it because it makes them look great. If Oprah's telling me, oh, you know, the law of attraction works because look at me, I'm Oprah, I'm thinking, well, yeah, you're Oprah. Like, you have a survivor bias. You are one of the very few people who's managed to climb up this ladder in life to the very upper echelon, this very elite 1%. And I don't think it was because of the law of attraction. I think it's because lots of other stuff. But it's fair enough if you believe in it because it's your life experience. I really don't like any of those ideas that put the blame on us as individuals, when for me we are all interconnected, and the way we all live our lives and the way we all exert power in certain ways affects each other. And so that is something that just really gets my goat. But I think there are so many people who are desperate for ways out of the financial situations they find themselves in at this moment in history, and there are answers to that in witchcraft and in the occult. So although I do have those critiques around some of the ideas that are floating about in the witchcraft space, I do think that overwhelmingly this interest in witchcraft is an exciting and positive movement. I think that the interest that we're seeing in witchcraft and paganism really shows people who are deeply interested in being connected to the earth and who are deeply interested in working for the earth's prosperity and the earth's health long term. You know, a lot is said about people doing their own research or not being literate enough in our current society, but I think lots of the ideas in modern witchcraft are about not accepting things wholesale, not just accepting the religious stories or other stories that we were raised with, but actually questioning and critiquing and exploring the world for ourselves. And I think that that is a positive thing that people are doing that shows some critiquing of the world in which we live and a willingness to explore and question and come to our own conclusions on things. I also know how much work there is still to be done on the topics of feminism, and I haven't touched on it much in this video, but there are definitely a lot of witches who are LGBTQ and who experience a lot of the same or similar oppression as women do. In terms of the way their sexuality and their bodies are policed. And I think any movement or idea that is interested on some level in bodily autonomy and in liberation of these groups, that's a positive movement, and witchcraft is definitely interested in those areas and those topics. And also finally, I just think that witchcraft has been a fun thing to explore. I think it's fun to get a little bit spooky, especially around Halloween. So if it is something that you are interested in exploring further, I hope that I've given you a list of good reasons to get into it. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting and informative and gave you some food for thought. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and please tell me if you enjoy these witchcraft themed videos and if you'd like me to dig into this more in the future. If you want more witchy content to feast on this Halloween, I have my video on the Wheel of the Year, which is this pagan Wiccan concept, and I also have a video of music recs where some of the music recs are specifically witchy songs and witchy artists. So please check those out. Have a lovely Halloween, and I will see you on the next one. Okay, bye.